Today we're going to dig into part 3 of our message on our purposes. And to make it easy, we've listed our purposes here on the wall behind me. These are our purposes as a church. These are what Jesus gave us. They're also our purposes in life as individuals. You don't have to go discover and figure out and choose a purpose and hope you got the right one. Jesus has given us purpose, and you and I can then figure out how we live that out according to the gifts and opportunities he gives us. But here's the purpose he's given us: love God. And we talked about that a couple weeks ago, and we said the gateway into a loving relationship with God is prayer. And seeing prayer as this gateway into a loving relationship, not how we ask God for stuff we want or get God to do things we want him to do. It's the gateway into a loving relationship where we know God and we're known by God. And so we encourage us to pray. Last week we started talking about love others, and we talked about how we love others in this community, that is the church. And we said that we do it by devoting ourselves to fellowship. And that word fellowship means a shared partnership that's centered around faith in Jesus. We devote ourselves to it. We don't go to church. We devote ourselves to being the church, being together in a small group, sharing life together, giving and caring for each other's needs. We devote ourselves to the community of believers. Today I want to look at part 2 of that, which is now turning and saying, loving others means also showing compassion in particular to those who are outside of the church. That's what we want to talk about today. Because, and here's where I want us to start. Compassion is slowly dying in our world. There's a lot of compassion going around. A lot of people still behave compassionately, but compassion, picture compassion as a tree. It is rotting from the inside out. The roots of compassion, this compassion tree, the center of it is rotting away, and pretty soon it's going to come crashing to the ground. Not too long ago, I was at home, and I heard chainsaws and chippers going down the block. And so I took my dog, and we went out to see what was going on. And they were cutting down one of the trees on our block that it looked like it was 100 years old. This thing was a beautiful tree. It looked good to all of us. And everybody, the neighbors are outside wondering, what's going on? Why are they taking down this beautiful tree? And as they got to the bottom and did that last cut of the last bit of trunk before you could see the stump, it fell over, and you could see it was hollowed out inside. And the stump was hollowed out inside. It was rotting from the inside out. And pretty soon, it's just a matter of time, that tree was just going to fall over and crash into something because it was rotting from the inside out. They actually have a name for that with trees. It's called heart rot. And I would say that this is what's happening to compassion in our world as well, and in our nation as well. The roots and the trunk of compassion, the rationale and the justification for being compassionate to someone who's not me or not in my circle, to going out of my way, to sacrificing my resources, my time, my energy for someone who's an other, who's outside of me, outside of my circle. The rationale and the justification for doing that is getting chipped away and getting eaten away. And eventually the compassion tree is going to come crashing down, and compassion will no longer be valued in our world because of heart rot in this compassion tree. Because, here's why. The heart of compassion is our connection to God, is our belief and our understanding and our knowledge of God and who he is, and how he has demonstrated compassion through Jesus. That is where we learn. That is the foundation. That's our rationale and justification. Why would we go out of our way for another who is not me? Why wouldn't I just look out for me? Because that's not what my God who made me did. That's not how he behaves. That's my rationale. That's my justification. That's the reason to be compassionate. But when we lose faith in God, we lose that. It gets eaten away. And I think that's what we see happening already more and more. I hear people ask the question, why should I care about them? They're not me. They're not part of my group. They're not part of my state. They're not part of my country. They're not part of my family. I even hear this in the mouths of people who call themselves followers of Jesus. Hey, we need to look out for ourselves, our cause, our thing. And wondering, why should I care and show compassion to those outside of me? Outside of us. And I would say our culture has no answer for that. Secular culture has no answer, no way of convincing people. We can pass laws that make it happen. Government can tell us you have to be compassionate. We're going to take some of your stuff and make you be compassionate and share it with others. They can do those kinds of things, but that doesn't make us compassionate. And there's still what's the compelling reason why we ought to be without God? Now, I've listened to debates between Christians and atheists or agnostics about this. And atheists and agnostics will say, I don't need some exterior objective source telling me I need to be compassionate. It's just common sense. There are ways I like to be treated, and I know other people would like to be treated those ways too. And so I treat them those ways because I want to be treated that way. There are ways I don't like to be treated, and I know that others don't like to be treated that way either. And so I'm not going to treat them that way because it just makes sense. I don't want them to treat me badly. And so they will say, I don't need some objective reason. That's all the reason I need is just, this is what I want. This is the kind of world I want. This is what I think is important. And more people are asking, why? Why should I go out of my way? Why do we need to do this? What's the reason? How do I make sense of this? And again, what's the answer? How do you say, here's why? And they would say, well, because I feel like that's what's the best thing to do. It just makes sense. Now, I listened to one Christian author point out where that sense of it just makes sense comes from. That it just makes sense is not a reason to be compassionate. It just feels right is not a rationale that supports the command to be compassionate. Right? That's just a feeling we have. Where does that feeling come from? And he writes this. He says, that sense that compassion is right, he says, is riding on the continued currents of millennia of cultural inheritance that is influenced by Christianity and Judaism. That is what makes these ideals make sense. The fact that we've inherited centuries and centuries and millennia of these ideals from faith in God. That has shaped who we are today. But as that gets removed, he says this, I worry about this. These moral ideals of loving neighbor and honoring her human rights, regardless of who they are or where they are, make sense to us now. But if they are based on the cultural inheritance of religion, belief in God, then will these ideals make sense to our grandchildren as belief in God fades away? Won't they just ask, well, yeah, of course I care about my not suffering, but why should I care about someone else not suffering? Without a belief in God, we don't have a good answer to that. A real reason. We're only left with, well, it's survival of the fittest. And if you choose to be nice, but you're really just doing it to serve yourself. There's no rationale that can stand up. And we see that in our world. People are more and more asking, why should I worry about them? I'm going to worry about me, about my group. And the church, the community of God's people, we're the ones who have the answer to this. We're the ones who are responsible to care for this tree of compassion in our world. Because God has planted it in us. And we're the ones who should be a living demonstration because God is supposed to live in and among us. So we should be this living demonstration of what compassion looks like and doing it because we have this relationship with God, showing to the world as the world decays and falls apart and begins to show less and less compassion and question why we even should. We're going to be more and more alone saying, here's why we should, and demonstrating it in our relationship with God. And that has been the truth from the very beginning. This is what the church has been like. Last week, we looked at a passage that shows the church cared for one another inside the church. They shared what they had in common. They cared for each other's needs. They ate together. They all cared for each other inside the church. And some people look at that and say, oh, so the church, we only really need to worry about each other. And they miss the very next chapter. And what happens. So today I want to go to Acts chapter 3. And I want us to look at what happens next in this community of faith. How this community of faith develops and demonstrates and develops its priorities in engaging the world outside of itself. It says in Acts chapter 3, verses 1 through 10, you can follow along on the screen in your own Bible or in our app, in our notes. You can follow along there and take notes. This is what it says. This is the story we find there. One day, Peter and John were going up to the temple at the time of prayer, 3 p.m. Now, a man who was lame from birth was being carried to the temple gate called Beautiful, where he was put every day to beg from those going into the temple courts. And when he saw Peter and John about to enter, he asked them for money. Peter looked straight at him, as did John. And then Peter said, "Look at us." And so the man gave them his attention, expecting to get something from them. Then Peter said, "Silver or gold I do not have, but what I do have I give to you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, walk." And then taking him by the right hand, he helped him up, and instantly the man's feet and ankles became strong. He jumped to his feet and began to walk, and then he went with them into the temple courts, walking and jumping and praising God. And when all the people saw him walking and praising God, they recognized him as the man who used to sit begging at the temple gate called Beautiful, and they were filled with wonder and amazement at what had happened to him. Now, you're going to have to put your imagination cap on for a moment, and just here's what I want you to picture. Picture not being able to walk from birth. You've never been able to walk. Now, today, you'd have all kinds of resources to help you. 2,000 years ago, you wouldn't have that much. And so every day, this guy would get dropped at this particular gate going into the temple courts, the gate named Beautiful. What better place, right? What better place to stop and to beg than this gate where people are going into the temple. They're going to feel like, oh, God's watching us now because we're at the temple. Let's make sure we give him a little something. So people would pass by and they'd drop coins in and they'd, show him that courtesy, show him that little bit of, sort of compassion. But no one ever showed him real compassion until this moment when Peter and John stopped and looked at him. And here I want to draw from this encounter just a few lessons for us about what compassion is, what it looks like in our life, and what it does. So first observation is this. Compassion is not only for insiders. We could skip by that and say, yeah, but that's really important here. This guy is not part of the church. He's not part of this new community of believers. He has nothing to offer them. He's just some guy begging on their way into the temple. In fact, he's less than just some guy. The way he's treated, he's not part of the Christian community. He's not even really part of his own community, it feels like. Because every day, he's picked up and carried away from his community, his family, his friends, all those people, carried away from them and dumped at this gate to beg. There you go. That's what you're good for. Beg and bring home some money that maybe, you deserve to eat. Dumped at this gate all his life from the time he was a little boy. Just imagine that day after day. They pick you up, they carry you away from home, away from your community, and drop you at this gate to beg. This man is not part of their community. He's not really even part of his community. And Luke's gospel reminds us over and over again. Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, and he also wrote Acts. And the theme that runs through, if you were to read them together, that you'll see, Luke points out over and over again how Jesus and Jesus' followers show compassion to the outsiders. Luke's gospel is full of it. Jesus shows compassion to tax collectors, the traitors of their people, to Roman soldiers, the guys who invaded their land and moved in and took over everything and made life miserable for them. But Jesus showed compassion even to them. He showed compassion to people who were weird and odd and possessed by demons. He showed compassion to widows and people who were overlooked. He showed compassion to people with horrible skin diseases, even touched them when no one else would go near them. He even showed compassion to the insurrectionist on the cross next to him. Jesus demonstrated that compassion is not limited to insiders or those who are worthy of compassion because they're only in a bad spot through no fault of their own. He showed compassion to everyone because he knew no one really deserved it. And Peter and John simply follow Jesus' example, and they take compassion on this guy, even though he's an outsider, not part of their community, has nothing to offer them, nothing he can give them, but they show him compassion because they've learned from Jesus. Compassion is for outsiders, not just for insiders. And so what did they do that was so amazing? What did compassion look like? Let's look at them for our example. Verse 4 says, Peter and John, they're going in, they stop. It says, Peter and John looked at him. Now, a lot of people saw this guy. Every day, year after year, a lot of people saw this guy as they walked in. They'd see him, they'd drop a coin, and they'd keep walking by. They saw him, but they didn't really make eye contact. The way most of us grew up, for me, growing up in New York City, there was this thing where you just don't make eye contact. With certain people on the street, you don't make eye contact. When there's a homeless guy coming by, try not to make eye contact, because then, they might talk to you or ask you for something. You're parked or you're at a stoplight and someone's walking up. You just try not to make eye contact, pretend you're on the phone. It's a natural thing that we learn to do. I remember in Christmas time, we would go into Rockefeller Center to see the big tree and check out all the stores and everything. And driving through town, I remember my heart breaking, even as a kid, because guys would come up to the car begging, and the rule was, don't make eye contact. Don't really look. We do that today. We still do that today. We do that not just with people who maybe are in dire straits. We do that with, that person at work who's always asking for help with something, and they come by near your office, and you're like, you're suddenly on an important phone call, even though no one's on the other side of the line. You suddenly have an important email. You suddenly have something urgent to do. Now, because we're so many working from home, it's much easier to ignore people who are needing help. We just kind of don't make the eye contact. Peter and John look at him. They stopped and they looked. And our English translation tries to show us how powerful this word is and the depth of this word by translating it and calling it looking straight at him. That should be a clue to us. This is more than just, they looked at him, they saw him. They looked, this word means they looked deeply, searching, trying to understand. That's the kind of look this is. This is a deep and penetrating look. That's what this word is. Everywhere else it's used, by Luke in particular too. It's a deep and penetrating look, trying to understand and see. That's what kind of look this is. Everyone else, they saw the guy, glanced, dropped a coin. Peter and John stop. They look at him, and they see he doesn't need money. He doesn't need coins. He needs something much deeper. He needs healing. He needs restoration to community. He needs someone to see him and show him deep and real compassion. And they saw all that because they stopped and they looked. Compassion isn't doing the least we can do to allay our conscience. Oh, so I gave a little bit so I feel better. Now, I was generous. It isn't about putting on shows of support. Compassion stops, compassion looks, and compassion sees. That's what compassion does. He was asking for money, but Peter and John didn't even have money, which was probably best because money is a cheap substitute for genuine compassion. Everyone else just tossed them a coin and, yeah, we're compassionate people. They weren't compassionate people because no one stopped and looked and saw him. That's what compassion is. That's the beginnings of compassion, at least. And so they didn't have money to give him, but they stopped and they looked and they saw and they offered him Jesus. And you know what? It's probably better for you and I to come across needs that we don't have resources to meet, because that will teach us something that Peter and John already knew. Peter and John already understood the thing we struggle with sometimes, the thing that holds us back from being compassionate this way. And it's this. They understood that our compassion does not need to be limited by our limitations. We hide behind our limitations so often. We hide behind, I don't really have anything I can give them. We would just say to them, sorry, I don't have any change on me. I only have credit cards nowadays, right? And that would be the end of it. That's the beginning of it for Peter and John. That's the beginning of it for people who are following Jesus. Yeah, I don't have any money to give you, but I'm going to give you what I do have, because I've stopped and I've looked and I've seen you and I see your need. And so I offer you Jesus. Our compassion doesn't need to be limited by our limitations. So they tell the guy, get up, In Jesus' name, get up. And the man gets up and he starts running and leaping and jumping in the air. Now, this guy hasn't walked since birth. So imagine this healing is amazing and miraculous. And people obviously and naturally start to notice, hey, that's the guy who's been sitting outside the beautiful gate like all his life. He's running around. Did you see that? What happened to him? How is he healthy? Look at how high he can jump. Like they're all going nuts seeing this. And they find out that Peter and John just, helped him up. And so they think Peter and John are amazing. And oh, look what you did for him. Look at how you gave him healing. And listen to what Peter says to them. He says, verse 12, why does it surprise you? Why do you stare at us as if by our own power and godliness we made this man walk? He tells them how it happened in verse 16. By faith in the name of Jesus, this man whom you see and know was made strong, it is Jesus' name and the faith that comes through him that has completely healed him, as you can all see. When you think about it, all Peter and John did was stop and look and see. And then they just offered him Jesus. Jesus is the one who healed and transformed that man's life. Our compassion is the conduit through which Jesus moves and works and heals people. Our compassion doesn't heal people. Our role is not to heal people. Our ability is not to heal and restore and make right. And that's why throwing money at problems is foolishness, because while it's good to be generous and care for people, that doesn't solve the problem. The real problem, Jesus is the one who solves it. The best thing you and I can offer someone is Jesus. And our compassion is what opens the gateway for that. Our stopping, our looking, our seeing and offering Jesus. And then Jesus does the rest. That's why our compassion is not limited by our limitations. It doesn't matter what you have or don't have, because our compassion is the conduit through which the resources of Jesus come in and do what you and I never could do. Our compassion is that conduit. If we'll just love people enough to stop and to look and to see and offer them Jesus. That's what compassion is. We should pray, I think, God, please, let me come across needs that I can't figure out for the person, needs that I can't fix with a check or some money. Let me come across some things that are just so big that I know there's nothing I could do to fix it and make it right, so that I lean on just offering you, Jesus, and allowing you to do that healing and do that work. So Peter and John, it didn't cost them a penny. But that doesn't mean that compassion isn't sometimes costly. Because in the end, when you look at their lives and you recognize that compassion for them was just offering, looking, and seeing and offering Jesus. They didn't give up any money. They didn't have any money. But they did have a cost. And compassion does have a cost sometimes. Because right after this happens and this whole crowd gathers and everyone's like, this is crazy, the leaders of the temple come in and the temple guard come in and they arrest Peter and John. And because it's later in the day and the rulers of the temple don't want to be bothered, they're going home for dinner or whatever, they say, just throw them in jail. So just throw them in jail for showing compassion to a guy who used to be lame but now can walk. They throw him in jail, and they spend the night in this, and don't picture, pictures of jail the way we see it today. Picture a dank, dark, stinky, rat-infested place dug out in the bottom of some building. They throw him in jail, and they spend the night there. And then they drag them out in the morning, and they yell at them, and they threaten them. They threaten their lives. They tell them, no more talking about Jesus. No more, just stop. Just get out of here. Be quiet. Compassion can be costly. It can cost us all kinds of things. It can cost you your freedom. Compassion can be costly. There's an author named Henry Nouwen who grew up in Holland a long time ago, has written a lot of really compelling books about relationship with God and what it means to live in relationship with God. But he shares a story about something that happened to him as a 13-year-old boy that taught him what compassion is. I just want to share it with you today. He says, one of the most vivid memories from my youth is connected to a little goat that my father gave me when I was 13 years old. It was the last year of the Second World War. and the goat's name was Walter. And me as a 13-year-old boy, I loved that goat. And in the midst of a world that had been falling apart, even at that time, he says, the D-Day armies that had come in and brought rescue, they were cut off from them by the rivers around where they lived. And so they didn't have supplies. And many people in their community were starving and hungry and dying of hunger. He says, I loved my little goat. He said, I spent hours and hours collecting acorns for him, taking him on long walks, play fighting with him, grabbing him by his little horns as they were growing and wrestling with him. And I'd carry him in my arms, and I built a pen for him, and I built a little cart that he could pull alongside of me. And every morning when I woke up, I'd run out and I'd feed him. And as soon as I got home from school, I'd run home and I'd feed him, and we would talk. And I would tell him all sorts of things. And he was my best friend. My goat Walter and I were best friends. And then one morning I woke up and I went out to the garage where his pen was, and he was gone. Someone had stolen Walter. He says, I don't remember ever in my life, before then and since then, ever crying so much and sobbing so hard. I screamed from the grief at losing him. He said, my father and mother hardly knew how to console me. It was the first time I ever learned about love and about loss. I said, years later when the war was over and we all had enough food again, my father told me what had happened. He said, my father knew who stole the goat. It was our gardener. But my father never said anything to our gardener about it, because even though he saw my pain, because he knew that the gardener's family was starving to death and hungry. And they had no food. And this goat was what kept them alive, even though it cost me so much pain. He said, I now realize that both Walter and my father taught me something about compassion. Compassion can be costly, but it will never bankrupt you, because our compassion draws from a deep reservoir of compassion that enabled God our Father to sacrifice his Son, Jesus, to allow Jesus to suffer incredible pain and agony so that you and I could live. Our compassion draws on that deep and unending reservoir of compassion, because God looked and God saw our brokenness, our pain, the agony in our world caused by our sin and the injustice we inflict upon one another. He looked and he saw it, and he didn't turn away and say, they're outsiders to me now because of their rebellion and their sin and their rejection of me. He didn't do that. Instead, he had compassion on us, even though we were outsiders, compassion enough to sacrifice even his son and his son's pain. He showed compassion in Jesus, as Jesus didn't treat us as outsiders, but actually stepped inside our world as one of us and showed us compassion by showing compassion to everyone he met, even though no one he met deserved it. Jesus' compassion knew no limits. It went even beyond the cross and the grave. And now Jesus calls you and me, the church, in this broken world where the tree of compassion is dying. He calls on us to keep this compassion healthy and strong by being the people who are connected to God in this reservoir of compassion and living it out in this world without limitation, by stopping, by looking, and by seeing the needs of people and introducing them to Jesus, meeting their needs with that kind of compassion. That's what he calls us to do. That compassion might be costly sometimes. Might cost us a lot, but it will never bankrupt us, because we are always drawing on this deep, unending reservoir of God's compassion. Worship team, would you come back? Our world needs us. Our world needs us to maintain this compassion that God our Father has shown us. It needs us to do it. And a couple weeks ago, I suggested that in order to build this loving relationship with God, it requires prayer, constant prayer as at least our starting point into this loving relationship with God. And I suggested that every morning when you wake up, just start by saying, "Good morning, Jesus," as a way of just remembering and reconnecting to God each day, each morning. Just simple thing. You wake up in bed and you say, "Good morning, Jesus." And let that set the stage for the rest of your day, communicating with God in this loving relationship. This is what we need. That relationship with God, loving God, is where this compassion will grow out of us. Not so that we'll do compassionate things. That's not our goal here today. My goal is not for you and me to go out of these doors or when you're at home, leave your home and say, "I got to go do something compassionate. I got to go do more compassionate things." That's not our goal. That'll last for a little while, but it won't last for long. Our goal is to become compassionate people. Become people of compassion. And that requires this connection to God every day, starting, praying, "Good morning, Jesus," and living out that life of prayer and connection to Him. That's where we tap into this reservoir of compassion. And so today I just want to suggest adding one more thing to that prayer. When you wake up in the morning, first thing you do, say, "Good morning, Jesus." And then add to that, "Open my eyes." Good morning, Jesus. Open my eyes. Before I open my eyes and look at that stupid phone and the agenda for the day and everything that's got to get done and all the things I'm supposed to do that from yesterday, and look at the messages and the Facebook nonsense, before I open my eyes and see that, before I open my eyes and see the stuff around my house that I got to do and take care of and neglected to do, and before I open my eyes and turn on the news and hear about the latest tragedy, the latest thing that's going wrong, the latest fighting, the latest whatever that's happening in our world, in our nation, before I open my eyes and look at all that, Jesus, when I open my eyes, Lord Jesus, help me to see with compassion today. Help me to see with compassion everyone who I see. Help me to stop and to look and to see their need and to connect them to you, to offer you to them, Jesus. That's what I want to invite you to do each day. Good morning, Jesus. You open my eyes. You open my eyes. Wipe out all the garbage and help me see, help me look with a real and genuine compassion. When you do, you might begin to feel overwhelmed at how much compassion our world needs. That's why it's so amazing that none of us are in this alone. We're all doing this together. And I'll remind you something we've said many, many times before. Do for the one what you wish you could do for the many. You can't maybe offer compassion to every need you see when you're scrolling through your news feed or watching TV. Turn that stuff off. It's overwhelming. There's a person next door to you. There's a person maybe in your own home. There's a person at work. God wants you to stop, to look at them, to see them, and offer Jesus to them. Show them that compassion and see what Jesus will do in their life. Even just that one person.